passing item number 1. So we'll move on to item number 2, which is a briefing regarding the anti-displacement funds in Project Connect.
Good afternoon. My name is Erica Leek. I'm the Development Officer with the Housing and Planning Department. We wanted to provide an update of where we are related to the Project Connect Anti-Displacement funding. Next slide. So we will cover the funding amount and process, the sequence of working with the Austin Transit Partnership, the Project Connect sequence plan, and also the most recent resolution regarding the anti-displacement funding. Next slide. So as you all know, as part of the contract with the voters, there were $300 million included from Project Connect tax revenue specifically for anti-displacement strategies, including acquiring real property for affordable housing. To be able to start to use those funds, there are a few steps we need to take in the meantime. One of those includes creating an interlocal agreement or grant agreement between Austin Transit Partnership and the City of Austin to implement those strategies. And staff is already in working with the staff at Austin Transit Partnership to develop that grant agreement, and we hope to bring it forward to both the Austin Transit Partnership and Austin City Council in the coming weeks. And then at the same time, staff from a number of different departments are working with community members and consultants to develop an equity assessment tool. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So the interdepartmental team that is working on the equity tool includes the Equity Office, Innovation Office, Resiliency Office, Housing and Planning Department, and the Transportation Department. As part of the process to develop that tool, we recognized that we needed to define an environment to advance equity so that the tool can be effective. We also needed to work with residents to create that tool. And then obviously the future step is to implement and assess the tool. Next slide. So in terms of the environment that's necessary for the tool to be able to be effective, it needed an environment that really is conducive to receiving the data and information in the tool. So that includes centering the values of and having a shared mandate for racial equity, to identify and correct imbalances to power and decision-making structures, and also to make sure that the systems are set up to have accountability to people who are most directly impacted by displacement pressure. Next slide. So part of the way that we are being able to implement that strategy to create an environment that will make the tool successful is by recruiting people from the community who are vulnerable to displacement to be part of the team to develop the equity tool. So the displacement risk factors are people who live in gentrifying areas. We were using uprooted maps for that. Making less than $43,000 per year, had experienced homelessness, that they might lack access to a personal vehicle, and being part of a demographic that is vulnerable to displacement. So we had an application process where people noted which risk factors they had, and then that scoring criteria was used to select 30 residents. They're being paid $25 an hour. We're estimating it'll be approximately 30 hours of work. And they have already been selected, and that process is underway. Next slide. So in terms of the whole process to develop the equity tool, one of the first stages of the process is to normalize the idea of having this equity lens. And so we've had a couple of different training sessions with the consultants, the participants and city and Cap Metro staff to really talk about what it looks like to center racial equity in the discussions. And so that is intended to make sure that we all have the same understanding of what that means, and also to talk about, you know, how we do center those values in this process. The next step will be to work on the co-creation of the actual tool. That will take place over a number of different sessions with the community members and consultants to think about, you know, what are some of the priorities for the funding, and what would the outcomes of the use of that funding need to look like to make sure that the outcomes are equitable. And then the third phase is speaking to accountability and making sure that the people who are vulnerable to displacement that we city staff are accountable to those people. So that will be an ongoing process. Next slide. I know that you all have seen versions of this slide multiple times. This is speaking to what's happening at various phases in the process. In 2021, we are working on the Anti-Displacement Program grant agreement. And as I mentioned, we're working on that right now to bring it to both Boston Transit Partnership and City Council for approval. Next slide. And then in terms of the Project Connect sequence plan, the last line of this slide speaks to the schedule for the deployment of the anti-displacement funds. So that includes $100 million in the first 3 years, and then the second $200 million are spread out across the following 10 years. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mandy DeMaio.
Here we go. If we can go on to the next slide. I wanted to talk about a very recent development, which last month, as you all know, City Council approved a resolution that acknowledged the contract with the voters with the anti-displacement funding, and acknowledged that we are waiting on the memorializing of the grant agreement with Boston Transit Partnership, as well as the development of the equity tool, as Erica mentioned, but recognizing that there is urgency because Project Connect is moving at a fairly fast clip. And accordingly, Council directed us to make available $23 million this fiscal year for some very specific activities, which we're excited to kickstart. So if we could go to the next slide, I want to describe those. The two priorities that were articulated in the resolution were both land acquisition and then preservation of existing affordable housing. And I'll start first with land acquisition. This was to prioritize community-based organizations, so 501c3 nonprofit community-based organizations, to be able to acquire smaller sites and really enable them to do what we call rapid acquisition of vacant land in order to create affordable housing down the road. The focus should be on, of course, areas that are vulnerable to displacement, and the focus needs to be the Project Connect high capacity corridors. So that's one focus of the $23 million. The other focus is preservation. So really being able to strike fairly quickly, providing us with the funding in order to facilitate that, to preserve existing rental or ownership opportunities. We're talking about larger sites, so really greater than an acre or certainly greater than 5 units. We want to enable the creation of cooperatives or support the creation of cooperatives. We want to partner with nonprofits that have a demonstrated strong record in affordable housing. Again, just like land acquisition, we're focusing on areas that are vulnerable to displacement and on Project Connect high capacity corridors. We can go to the next slide. I can talk about next steps regarding that resolution that was passed again just last month. We're in the process of developing program guidelines, which will lay out the program parameters and the processes for nonprofits to be able to tap into this funding. We are also in the process of developing an RFQ, or request for qualifications, so that we can pre-certify qualified nonprofit organizations, and the funding would be deployed exclusively to those pre-certified nonprofit organizations. The reason for the RFQ process is we want to be able to deploy the funding quickly. Right now, you all may know, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about our 2018 general obligation bonds, we have a quarterly application process for all of our funding, and we have heard from some of our nonprofit, particularly our smaller nonprofit partners, that the timing doesn't always align with the timing necessary in order to do some rapid acquisition. So we want to create a separate avenue for those folks to be able to access the funding. But we want to create a process where we have pre-certified the organization, so we know that they're qualified, that they have the capacity, that they have the understanding about the vulnerability of certain communities, and that they understand the importance of aligning affordability with the Project Connect corridors. So the RFQ will follow our current AHFC, Austin Housing Finance Corporation procurement policies, which were adopted in December of 2019. And depending on the level of funding, this may be administratively approved. Our AHFC treasurer, Rosie Trulove, has authority up to $300,000. If in fact funding is higher than $300,000, we will of course go through the process to come to AHFC board, mayor and city council, for approval. We go to the next slide, which I think is really the wrap up, and we're happy to take any questions about any of this. We hope to have the RFQ draft ready within the next month in order to get that out on the street. We've already begun conversations with some of our community-based partners in order to get a better idea of the requirements for qualifications that we'd like to see in the community.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions from committee members? Councilmember Renteria and then Mayor Pro Tem. And then
yes, thank you for that presentation. I would like to know, is most of the land purchase or keeping the affordability and anti-displacement, is that all going to be concentrated on the blue, the orange line, and what's the other one? The red line improvement?
So, Erica, please correct me if I'm wrong, but no, we are not geographically limited. Our limitation for the Federal Transit Administration is we need to be for land acquisition within ideally 1/2 mile, but there is the possibility to do 1 mile of a Project Connect line. So that could be any of the lines. And we are not limiting our nonprofit partners in terms of land acquisition to the blue line or the orange line. The limit is area vulnerable to displacement and within proximity of a project connection.
Great. Thank you for that information.
Mayor Pro Tem, then Councilmember Kitchen, then Councilmember Evans.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask about on slide number 11, we spoke specifically to preservation, and you said larger units. And so as you can imagine, this storm really has our existing affordable, but somewhat older housing stock, especially multifamily housing stock, on my mind. And so I just, most of my questions are about that preservation effort, and then subsequently just what do we anticipate in the way of infrastructural investments?
So there is a lot of interest, and there has been interest for years around the topic of preservation, which, as you note, is complicated because a lot of our affordable housing, whether it's naturally occurring affordable housing or some of our older tax credit properties, so older but income restricted, maybe going out of their income restrictions, requires a substantial amount of investment. And so we would anticipate a partnership between Austin Housing Finance Corporation and the developer or partner of the property. And most likely, for most of these properties that we're contemplating, it would involve recapitalization. We would need to assess the level of capital improvements that are necessary. We need to look at refinancing or perhaps applying for new tax credits. So resyndicating the tax credits. It is a lengthy and complicated and frankly expensive process. We rely heavily not just on we have fantastic city legal folks, but we also rely on outside counsel and outside financial advisors to make these things happen. And that would primarily be related to our larger multifamily properties. So I'm thinking properties in the 100 plus units. There are some opportunities with some of our mid-range affordable housing that may not require the same amount of recapitalization or investment. But there are challenges with that because the market can often act more quickly than we as a quasi-government. I'm sorry, you're on mute, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And as you were speaking, I just found myself thinking, the varying degrees. It's tiered, right? And you said mid-range, which I hadn't heard before. But it would be very helpful, I think, for me as I'm putting together, and Director Truelove is helping me put together a list of complexes that are tax credit complexes that are income restricted, and by district, because we suffered a lot of damage in my district. And so that to say, when you say mid-range, or what I'm thinking of as, sort of really the oldest housing stock, if there were some parameters for definitions there, I'm not asking you to give it to me now. I just wonder if y'all have some that might be helpful for what we're working on.
And I'm sorry, when I said mid-range, I did not mean from a cost perspective. I meant from a size perspective. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. So I, in my mind, because this is the way Travis Central Appraisal District often divides up properties, I think of less than 5 units. So 1 to 4 units, and then the 5 to 50 units, and then 50 and larger, although we don't have a whole lot between the 50 and the 100 range. So the larger complexes, which I think based on some of our email conversations in your district, which suffered a lot of damage, are a lot of the properties that are maybe not subsidized by us, but have been subsidized by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, in the past, or currently have a project-based voucher on them. So we have some limited ability to exert influence in those situations. We have more ability to exert influence when we actually have subsidized those properties. Again, those will be most large.
Thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember Kitchen.
Thanks. I have some questions about the allocation of the $23 million. And so one question and one just comment. So I know the language talks about areas vulnerable to displacement along Project Connect high capacity transit corridors, but I would urge you all to prioritize, because the reason for upfronting the $23 million was to try to get ahead of the curve areas that are coming first. Mm-hmm. So if you know, and I know it's not that specific in the resolution we passed because we don't want to tie your hands, you know, to see what opportunities are out there. But I really would, I would be concerned if we're not, if we don't use this 23 million to take advantage of really trying to protect for anti-displacement along those lines that are coming up first. Because, you know, that was the idea behind upfronting the 23 million this year to get a start on that. So, I'm going to want a little bit more detail about how you're looking at areas, and in your selection process, I would suggest that it would be important to have that as one of your criteria. I mean, not as a hard and fast criteria, but if you're as part of your selection process, if you're trying to decide between areas, going to lose the purpose of those, you know, of those. That 300 million is supposed to be to help with anti-displacement along those lines. So, and so I understand there'll be a scoring tool, right, that you all will be. How are you going to? I mean, how are you thinking you'll do that?
So our plan was to develop a request for qualifications for partners.
Right, that's what you said. I'm sorry.
Right. And so we have two different priorities. One is acquisition of small sites, which this is really for our local community development corporations or nonprofit organizations, many of which are not particularly active, I know, in terms of front-loading the dollars. They're not particularly active right along the blue and orange line. So we don't want to, we want to limit that. We want their activity, their preservation and acquisition activity to be focused on areas that are vulnerable to displacement. But maybe you're talking about the...
Well, I didn't mean, I'm sorry, I should be more specific. I didn't mean necessarily the blue and orange lines. There are also RT lines that are high quality lines. Pleasant Valley is one of them, and there's and I think there's two right now, the Expo and Pleasant Valley, that are first out of the gate, and then of course the orange and blue lines. So I'm just suggesting that you consider those, which would be more important in terms of priority and timeline than some later ones might be.
Agreed. And I understand. And yes, that will go into our calculus when we look at, and I think we're going to talk a little bit later about the 2018 bonds, which will include a discussion of the land acquisition dollars. And we have been keenly tuned into, even before it was Project Connect, and it was just the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, but our land acquisition, ensuring that our land acquisition is aligned with Project Connect for future development of affordable housing. So that definitely plays into.
Then last question, just a quick one, Chair. So what is your timeline then? I'm sorry for, you're going to do the RFQ process first. Just give me the cut to the chase. What's your timeline for actually making selections?
So we'd like to get the RFQ on the street in the next month or so, pre-select partners, and then let them loose into the market, provided they meet parameters, and then they can come to us for rapid acquisition funding. I'd like to see acquisitions occurring this summer. Keep in mind that 23 million is this fiscal year. So we'd certainly like to see the fruits of our labor by September 30th. I can't guarantee it. But then, of course, of the 300 million, we have 100 million kind of front loaded in these first 3 years. So we anticipate once the equity tool is developed, we have a better understanding of community needs, and based on the communities where Project Connect is coming, we'll be able to deploy funding, including most likely land acquisition funding through that process, through the equity tool, guided by the equity tool.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Councilmember Ellis.
Thank you, Chair. Can you all speak a little bit about, since there are 3 different timelines of $100 million to be spent, we know that land cost and housing prices aren't going down anytime soon. Have you given thought to how to get ahead of that market rate for those acquisitions, and how to make sure that even if you can only use 100 million within the first 3 years, how to get, you know, the most bang for the buck, if you will, seeing as how those costs are only going to be increasing throughout the years.
Sure. In terms of just land acquisition, which keep in mind that that is a portion of the 300 million. Really, the 300 million is for anti-displacement strategies that have really yet to be envisioned and really won't be fully fleshed out until the development and deployment of that tool. But to land acquisition specifically, I am looking forward to leveraging our other resources as a department. As you all know, we get a fairly significant and growing amount from the federal government for our block grant funding, which we have used in the past for land acquisition and property acquisition. We also have, of course, our general obligation bonds, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. We have our housing trust fund. We have other very specific fund sources related to transit-oriented development and our HPD homestead preservation district. So we have geographically constrained pots of funding that we'd like to leverage with this funding, whatever is determined to be for land acquisition, to be more strategic with our funds. On top of that, I will say we have been fairly successful, and we're looking forward to some upcoming successes with partnering with other departments who have excess underutilized land. In addition, partnering with some other taxing entities like Austin Independent School District. We're in the process, we purchased a parcel on Tannehill from AISD in District 1, which we're in the community engagement process right now. We're putting it out for solicitation. So we feel like there are some very strategic, based on our scan of the real estate landscapes and strategic acquisitions that we want to make sure we're part of in terms of the development of affordable housing. So I think really it is about partnering, leveraging, and keeping our ear to the ground on opportunities as they arise.
I appreciate that. I was thinking there would be an easy answer like spend it all up front, but it sounds like you put a lot more thought and process into how this is going to work.
We're trying to be very diligent, thoughtful, strategic, and somewhat conservative with our spending.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions on this item? Okay. No, there are two more. Councilmember Renteria and Councilmember Kitchen.
I just want to know, you know, years back we were talking about a strike fund and having private investors to be able to buy these end-of-life tax credits and not letting them go back. Do you know whether we still have that organization out there?
So we do. The organization is a nonprofit called Affordable Central Texas, and they just closed on their 4th property. So their focus was naturally occurring affordable housing. They closed on their 4th property, which I haven't seen yet, but it's supposed to be lovely. It's near the Apple campus in District 6. It brings their entire portfolio up to almost 1,000 units. And they are continuing to go strong. We're looking at opportunities to partner with other organizations. They've partnered with the Housing Authority of the City of Austin in the past, and we would look forward to partnering with them in the future.
That's great to hear that it's still going on. You know,
yes.
That's great. And another thing, it's I know that here, because of some of the nonprofit housing builders are having problems with, you know, they didn't get as much money from their like Habitat. They didn't get as much money from their national organization because money was really tight. Is there any kind of way or programs that we could help those kind of organizations to make sure that by using some of this fund, especially, you know, it has there on Onion and 4th Street, just across the street from our field, an opportunity, and if they can't go through their project Is there a way that we could buy it from them and maybe use that?
So interestingly, with the help of our law department, we have in our new RODA and ODA, so rental housing development and ownership housing development assistance, put not a reverter clause, but kind of like that. Like if the project cannot proceed, then we can go ahead and purchase land so we can secure it for affordable housing. We have not done that in the past, but I think we are very open to do that in the future. I will say with all of our nonprofits that we work closely with, including Habitat, we have supported, and we'll talk about this a little in the 2018 bonds, and we will continue to support all of these fantastic groups. We've also been working with them to diversify their funding sources and access alternative funding sources. We're in a really good position right now, partially because of COVID funding from the federal government, partially because of some increased funding at the federal level for our National Housing Trust Fund, that we are going to see a significant amount of funding become available from our state with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. And we are going to work our hardest to make sure that our nonprofit and for-profit partners can tap into that to minimize the amount of money that we put into projects. We want to stretch our dollars. This goes to what we were talking about with Councilmember Ellis. Stretch our dollars as far as possible so we can really leverage and be great stewards of those dollars and have more partners in each project.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great to hear.
Councilmember Kitchen.
Just a very quick thing. I just wanted to point out that the ILA is in process right now. The one that sets out the allotment schedule for the 300 million. So, I, for one, am interested in seeing it upfronted even more than is being suggested. So, so I just wanted to let y'all know it's not a done deal yet, exactly the way it is. I think it's great. 100 million in the first 3 years, I think it's necessary. What concerns me is that the remaining dollars are spread out so much and maybe not upfronted as much as I'd like to see. Again, I don't know what's possible at this point. I just wanted to make it clear for everybody that that's not, those ILAs are not signed yet. So,
thank you.
Yeah, that will be going to the Austin Transit Partnership Board next week, and then it should be coming to the full council on March 25th.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all.